Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us on this Saturday afternoon. I know it's an important discussion we're having. Thanks to the awareness campaign by many organizations and individuals, more and more people in our community are now recognizing the seriousness of youth mental health issue. Recently, a series of youth suicide cases happening in our community really reinforced our concern about the mental well-being of our children. There is nothing more sad and painful for parents to see their child dying at such young and vibrant age. While we mourn the loss of the precious lives of our youth with the parents and their loved ones, we want to do our best to educate ourselves to prevent these tragedies from happening. It's under these very sad circumstances that we are here today, convening this panel discussion with our panel experts and people who have personally experienced mental health struggles. Before I start today's panel discussion, it is my pleasure to introduce Justin Chen. Justin is the Executive Director and co-founder of Mass General Hospital MGH Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness. MGH Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness is also a partner organization for UCA's Youth Mental Health Initiative. Justin is also a native of DC metro region. He's an alumnus of Thomas Jefferson High School of Science and Technology in Arlington, Virginia. So I would like to invite Justin to say a few words. Because of the technical difficulties, I guess let's just move on. Justin is a good friend of us. And he's very compassionate, and he's the co-founder of the Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness. And I've seen Justin a couple of times, and we have done events together. And we hope we can continue to work together to increase the awareness and to help our parents and children to get help they need. So perhaps when Justin solved the technical issues, we'll come back to him. But right now, let's just get right into the panel discussion and Q&A. As some of you know that today's webinar is the third mental health webinars the UCA we have sponsored with our partner organizations, Cornerstone Education, MGH Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness. We have gotten a lot of feedbacks from our audience. Today, we will not have any feature presentation. We'll devote the entire session to answering the questions we have gotten from our audience. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to introduce our panel members, and their bios are available online, and they have spoken to us in our previous seminars. So the logistic is, in the first hour, I will have a list of prepared questions to ask the panel members. After that, the panel members will answer questions submitted by all of you through the Q&A tab. Please make sure that you submit the question through Q&A tab, not the chat box. I also want to remind everybody that our panel members cannot provide individual diagnosis here over Zoom. The intent of our discussion is to provide you with general guideline and knowledge. So please refrain from asking medical advice on any specific case or any specific individual. Thank you for your understanding. So let's get right into it. A lot of questions we have gotten from the parents are related to How do we tell whether our children are having depression or just a typical teenager mood swing? So what's the difference? What are the symptoms? How do we tell? And what are the different degrees of mental issues? So I want to pose this question to Dr. Xie and Dr. Chen.
Thank you, Paul. I think I can talk a little bit about your question related to what is a normal mood change and what is real depression. I think that's a really good question. A lot of parents are wondering. I think at the times we all feel probably feel down, and because of environmental triggers, it could be if we get a bad grade or if we have relationship challenges. So sometimes sadness, the feeling down can happen out of nowhere, but typically those feelings and they don't last too long and last for days, hours, and we will bounce back. But depression is different. Depression is characterized by longer and deeper feelings of despondency and also the presence of certain characteristic symptoms. Um, those symptoms reflect changes in our mood, our behaviors, our daily activities. It can last for more than 2 weeks, months, and even years, and being critical symptoms. And some of the typical symptoms of depression we usually experience are depressed mood, feelings of sadness, worthlessness, hopelessness, and excessive guilt. Some people may experience diminished interest in pleasure in activities, and some people may have weight change, either weight gain or weight loss, and also sleep difference, the challenges, either being insomnia, having trouble falling asleep, or the need to sleep a lot. So those can be typical symptoms of depression. It can also, additionally, it can be some people feel more tired throughout the days, less of energy, and feel more fatigue and diminished ability to concentrate or think and feeling indecisive. Depending on the number of symptoms and also the severity of those symptoms, and depressions can also be specified as mild depression, moderate depression, and also severe depression. Mild depression can involve couple of the symptoms we just mentioned. It can go on for days and are noticeable enough to interfere with your daily usual activities. And for moderate depression, in addition to including some of the symptoms that I mentioned, it can also people experience issues with their self-esteem and also more severity in their daily in impairing of their daily activities. Give you some of the examples that I have experienced with my clients in counseling. It could be students having trouble to go to classes. They are failing in their classes and they cannot get up out of their bed and they cannot stop crying and they cutting connections with their peers and friends, having social withdrawal. A lot of those can have a severe impairment in their daily life functioning. And when depression is severe and it can be life threatening, some people may experience suicidal thoughts and suicide desire, intent, or even attempt suicide. So those can be the symptoms of depression, typical symptoms of depression, but depression can look different in each individual. Um, what I want to emphasize here is that sharing those symptoms, and we don't expect, as clinicians, we don't expect our audience to learn how to diagnose depression. And we want you to be familiar with those symptoms, and so you know when there are any symptoms like this going on, that they are enough for you to raise your suspicion, and going to see a professional can be very important for your child. Professionals usually will conduct more in-depth questions and thorough assessment to decide what diagnosis they will usually provide to their children. Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Yes, of course. Perhaps I could add on, and obviously this is such an important question, and it's also such a big question. And thank you, Wei Young, for such a thoughtful, nice summary. I'll just add on to some of those points. So I think you've covered a lot of it. Just to underscore that depression and depression, along with other mental health conditions, are extremely common. And as Wei Young mentioned, depression can range from mild, moderate to severe. And know that regardless of the severity, depression is treatable, and in some cases it's preventable. And Wei Young mentioned this a little bit, but I want to go a little bit deeper, is that just like other medical illnesses, and depression is a medical illness, the etiology, the origins of it are due to a combination of factors. And very, very simple framework that I think can be helpful to think about is, as clinicians, we think about a biopsychosocial model, right? So biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors. The point here is that I think it can be very, very easy, for understandable reasons, for us to think first and foremost, usually, of the social factors, meaning we all start to think, oh, what is going on in this person's life that is causing them this stress, right? Like a bad grade, or school is stressful, or there's been emotional breakup, or a fight with a boyfriend or girlfriend. And certainly there can be these triggers that lead to depressive episodes. However, this is not always the case, right? There's always a combination of factors. So just want to highlight that there are also biological and psychological factors that often come into play. So biological factors are things like genetics and brain chemistry, right? And we don't have control over those things. Psychological factors may be things related to personality or temperament, a person's way of tendency towards thinking, and that can also influence. So it's really this combination of factors that together might influence someone's risk. It's not necessarily a guarantee, but might elevate someone's risk for developing depression. Right. So the point being, there isn't usually just one thing. And I mention this just because parents will often say to me, oh, well, what caused it? Or what happened? Or everything in my child's life is fine. What do they have to be depressed about? And just want to highlight that depression is a lot more complex than necessarily there being something that negative or stressful happened. The other point I want to highlight is that because of this biopsychosocial model, and the fact that we see there are all these factors, a person could not have anything that is obviously wrong or something obviously bad that's happened and still struggle with depression, and it's not their fault, right? In the same way that someone might exercise and eat well and still have high blood pressure or still be overweight, because there are lots and lots of factors. Depression is the exact same way. It's the same medical model. A few risk factors I want to highlight, because I know, Paul, we talked earlier about kind of different factors that contribute, and things like personality or temperament. This is not an absolute list by any means, but things like emotional sensitivity or perfectionism, or a person's tendency towards self-criticism or negative thinking or low self-esteem, things like social anxiety or anxiety in general may put someone at greater risk. These are just some things. Stress in general is one of the biggest risk factors for depression. And I would be remiss if I didn't highlight family conflict or stress or tension as often being a pretty significant risk factor. And then, not faulting anyone's culture, but there are also cultural factors that come into play. And it's not uncommon that second generation children, regardless of ethnicity or background, there are unique cultural stressors, right? For parents who are here, who've immigrated here and done amazing things to build a life for the family, provide for children. That's a stressor, coming to this country and having the acculturation stress of being a first generation parent here in the US. It's also can be stressful growing up a 1.5 or second generation child. This isn't anyone's fault. This is just another stressor, right? How can our youth be both Chinese and American? How do they balance these two cultures? That balancing can lead to great richness, and itself can also be a stressor. So just knowing that there are all these different factors that come into play. Another point I just want to highlight briefly, and Wei already mentioned this, that though there is this list of what we call diagnostic criteria, what psychologists and psychiatrists will look at to diagnose depression, that, just like all people, all things it's much more complex. So it's not necessarily just this checklist of symptoms. And depression can look very, very different person to person. This is where it gets challenging, and why Wei Yang was emphasizing, and I completely agree, it's so important to get help from a mental health professional who can help you think through. It's not your job to have to be able to diagnose. And so just to briefly highlight how depression can absolutely look like, as Wei Yang mentioned, kind of crying or sadness, or lying in bed and decline in functioning. It can also look like things like forgetfulness or oppositionality or irritability. And actually in teenagers, depression more often manifests as irritability before it necessarily manifests as sadness or crying. So just to highlight that, because that's something really different in teenagers compared to adults. Depression could also look like low motivation, low energy, poor sleep. It can look like changes like fallen grades or incomplete homework assignments or more screen time. And then, as Wei Yang mentioned, kind of more severe changes like hopelessness or suicide or self-harm thoughts. Also want to mention, for some people, they really feel their feelings in their body. So depression or other mental health challenges or stress in general, and we all relate to this, I think, to some degree, you can also feel it in your body. So is it headaches, tension in your back and shoulders, stomach aches? So there can also be physical symptoms of depression, absolutely. I also want to highlight that depression from the outside can also look like nothing at all. And I think this is another really, really important point. And especially in families where maybe children and parents don't speak as much, it would be really, really hard for you to know, right? And if your child from the outside looked like they were doing just fine, right? It could be that they're hiding their symptoms. And I hope that doesn't scare parents on this call. I just want to mention this because sometimes I'll hear from parents, oh, but they're doing fine. They're doing well at school and everything is going so well. They're not having a hard time. But inside, emotionally, that child may actually really, really be struggling. And so that emphasizes one point that I know we're going to get into deeper today. So I won't belabor this right now, but this is why parent-child communication and having open lines of communication is so, so, so important. Because with those open lines of communication, it's easier for parents to have an understanding of what their children or teens may be feeling or struggling with, to help you know how big your worry should be. And then lastly, and I know I'm sorry for this is going for so long, Paul, I know you'd mentioned about red flags, and just to highlight some bigger red flags for parents to look out for is more pervasive changes in your child's mood, behavior, or functioning. So you can get a bad grade and the child may be upset, but is that upset lasting for more than a few hours or more than a few days, right? Are they able to bounce back or not? Are things hitting them harder than they might normally hit them? Are they not doing things they normally do? Are they not taking pleasure in things they normally would take pleasure in? And then, of course, bigger red flags are things like escalating substance use or suicide statements or self-harm. Those are absolute red flags for which you would definitely want to seek help from a mental health professional. But even absent the red flags, if you have a worry, depression and other mental health issues, and even just stress alone, really, really deserves careful attention and support. And so if you have any worries at all, we really, really recommend that you talk to someone, that you talk to your child or teen, and to get help if needed. And I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more.
Thank you, Dr. Chen and Dr. Xie. It's very, very important we pay attention to what's going on in our children's life, not just their academics, but also their emotional condition. So we're very glad today Tim He and Sandy Chen are joining us. They both have personal experience with mental health struggles. And I would like to ask both of them to share their experience and their story, and particularly what they think what contributed to their struggles. And that'll be very helpful for the parents to understand from the patient point of view, from the children's point of view. So maybe Tim first and then Sandy. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think I've been struggling with mental health essentially my entire life, probably starting from like third, fourth grade. I had undiagnosed ADHD, and everything was fine for me because I always did well in school. I I never had trouble making friends, and I connected with people pretty well. But there was always just this feeling that I can't concentrate as well as I could sometimes. And it wasn't until I was in college, I went to college early, and I was not able to kind of immerse myself in the world as well as I wanted to. And once I did not deal with failures very well, or even things that I construed as failures. Maybe it's just like not doing well on a simple test, and that like combined with all the other stresses that were going on, I kind of spiraled. I was a musician in college, and I studied music. I played the saxophone. I always did very well, but I injured myself for maybe a period of 1 to 2 years, combined with the fact that I wasn't doing well in some of my courses. I kind of just closed off and stopped talking to essentially all of my friends. And I wasn't sure how to deal with just not being the person who I thought I was. And I could not dig myself out of this pit that I felt that I was in. Eventually, I had to take time off of school. I actually took about 2 years off of school before I actually went back. And I didn't seek treatment until my second year out of school because I felt like this was something that I could handle myself rather than it being a problem where I needed this support network to actually improve and try to get myself back on the right track. My lowest point was probably the year right, or I think the month right before I decided to stop school. That was when I attempted suicide. I was lucky that my roommate found me before anything terrible could happen, and took me to the clinic. But for me, a lot of it was being anxious about things, being unable to talk to people about my problems, and feeling that like I had failed my parents who had spent so much time and energy on me. Like my mom and dad took me to different music concerts, different performances, different competitions, spent thousands of dollars on all my instruments, all of my lessons. And it felt like not being able to succeed at what I wanted to do was something that was just an embarrassment to me and to my family. And from that, I just could not improve myself. I could not get better. And it was just quite a difficult time for me. It took 2 years, 3 years of talking with my therapist and psychiatrist and having a really good support network of people that I could talk to who could like share their own troubles and how they've dealt with it, to be able to even like get out of bed, talk to people. I used to not go out of the house because I just didn't want people who I'd never even met to judge me. And that was just something that I couldn't deal with. Obviously, I'm doing a lot better now. It's been like 6 or 7 years since my first visit with my therapist. And it's been quite a long journey, but it's definitely doable for people who are still stuck in that pit you feel like you can't get out of. And I think one of the most important things for me was actually reaching out to people again and starting to talk to them about my problems, starting to communicate well with others that I really started to improve.
Thanks, Tim. Sandy, can you share your story?
Sure. So growing up, I was a pretty shy kid. I like to keep to myself, and just I had a few friends here and there, but really, like, I was just bullied throughout school, and so I just always had like a really low self-esteem. And I think that contributed a lot to how I felt about myself. I always felt like I was a burden to people. I always felt like I didn't matter. I felt like I was never good enough. Also, aside from my peers, I also received a lot of pressure from my parents as well because they wanted me to excel academically. And there came a point, I think it was around the 8th grade when my depression really started kicking in. But I didn't really know what depression was at the time. And I just thought it was something that I thought there was something wrong with me and I didn't know what it was. So one day I just talked to my parents and I told them that I was feeling really down and like I've been feeling down for quite some time. And they took me to see my family doctor, and my family doctor she wasn't really supportive about it. She just thought that it was more so like just like teenage mood swings, nothing out of the ordinary. But I kept persisting and I said that there was something wrong, like I shouldn't be feeling this way. And when I was in 8th grade, that was also the year that I started to self-harm. And it would be like April or May, and it would be really hot outside, but I would have to wear long sleeves to cover up my self-harm. And I just knew that I didn't want to feel this way anymore. And I knew that if I didn't speak up, then something really bad would happen to me. And so I kept persisting, and finally my parents took me to see my psychiatrist. And after that, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and I was put on Adderall, but I still didn't feel right. Even though it helped me with my grades a little bit, I still felt like there was something that it was just really painful to talk about, and I didn't even know how to put into words at the time because I was just scared. I was scared of telling my parents that like I felt like I was a failure. I felt like I was a burden. That I felt like I was a disappointment to them, and I was scared of coming out with how I felt because I don't want to be judged. And when I would try to tell them how I felt, they would always tell me to just suck it up and that I was being weak. And I feel like that just made me want to internalize my feelings even more. And so eventually I just started to bottle everything up until one day I couldn't take it anymore. And there were several times where I tried to attempt suicide. And I remember the third time I attempted suicide, I think that was the wake-up call for me. After I had tried to attempt it, there was only one person I told, and that person came to my house and he told my parents what I had done, and they rushed me to the hospital immediately. And the doctors kept stressing how quick timing saved my life because of what I had done. I damaged my liver pretty badly and had to be transported to a different hospital in Washington, D.C. And I spent the next week in the ICU recovering, and luckily my liver healed on its own. It's still really hard for me to talk about to this day because it just really showed me how life can be taken for granted at times. Especially because like when I feel so low and I feel so overwhelmed, I feel like I want a way out, but what I really want is for the pain to just stop, but I really don't want my life to end. And I feel like whenever I attempted suicide, there would always be that instantaneous regret of me wishing that I didn't do what I had done. And so after that, I started taking my treatment more seriously. I started seeing my therapist more regularly, and I started being more honest about how I felt because I knew that if I wanted to feel better, I had to be honest with everyone and come to terms about what I was feeling. And I started to learn that it was okay to be upset. It's okay to be depressed as long as you keep fighting. And yeah, there were a lot of things that contributed to my depression, I think, such as like peer pressure from my parents, peer pressure or bullying or pressure from my parents as well, and my low self-esteem. But at some point, I decided to look past all of that and focus on how I could get better and how I could start being kinder to myself. And yeah, I'm just really glad that the person I told took me seriously. If they thought that I was joking or they thought that, I was just being dramatic or whatever, I would not be here today. So I'm just very glad to have this opportunity to share my experience with you all, and thank you.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Tim, for sharing your stories. And we parents oftentimes forget how vulnerable our children are. So, and one of the questions I persistently get from parents is, I have difficulty talking to my children. They just don't want to talk to me. And even I can talk to them, I want to get them to get help. They refuse to get help. So there is a problem here, the communication between parents and children. So I want to pose this question to Tim and Sandy. What do you think, what can parents do to help smooth the relationship, to improve the communication between uh, the parents and children? From your perspective, your experience, what can parents do to improve communication?
I think for me, one of the most helpful things that my mom has always done is she's taken a great interest in whatever I'm interested in. It doesn't matter what it was. She always wanted to be there and do it with me. I remember even from a young age playing video games with my mom, and she would be the one helping me with some of the harder levels. So that's something that just totally, I completely appreciate my mom for. And when I started school and began playing saxophone and everything, she would research saxophonists and different pieces and different things that she thought would be fun. And I'm pretty sure by the end of like my high school, she knew more about saxophone than probably even me. Um, but even so, I still felt that it was hard to talk to my mom about a lot of the troubles I was having, and a lot of it was just feeling like I didn't want to have failed in her eyes, even though I knew she would always be there to support me. But it just felt like talking about these kind of issues was me saying that I couldn't do the things that I wanted to do, and it just felt like a huge failure. Um, and she was the one that pushed me to go to a psychologist and a therapist. I felt like I just thought I could take care of this myself. I could do it on my own. And I tried that for a year. She gave me the time to try it for a year. But after that, she found a couple other people my age who had gone through depression and who anxiety and were talking to a therapist and had me communicate with them. And I felt like just talking with them and hearing about their struggles, how it was quite prevalent in the community, that it wasn't something that I had to hide. But that was when I knew that maybe I should actually seek help. And I'm really glad that I did, because I wouldn't be here today if I didn't.
Thanks, Tim. Sandy, can you share, what do you think parents can do to help improve their communication?
What really helped me with improving my communication with my parents was that they let me come to them if I ever need to talk. They didn't pressure me to talk to them about what was going on. They just opened up a line of communication, and they said, like, whenever I'm ready to talk about what I want to talk about, that they'll be there and they'll be there ready to listen. I think it's also important to emphasize that you're not there to judge, you're not there to criticize, but rather you're there because you want to support them no matter what, and they shouldn't be afraid to say what they want to say. I know there were times in the past where I would be scared to talk to my parents because I felt like I felt like a disappointment to them. I felt like a burden to them. But over time, I got past that because they kept telling me, like, they kept emphasizing that I could tell them anything about how I was feeling, and they would still love me unconditionally, and they would still support me no matter what. And that all they really want to do at the end of the day is be there for me. And it's also in the actions that they do, because I know it's a thing where, like, Asian moms, they'll like cut up fruit or like bring food to your room, and my mom always does that for me, and I think that's like the sweetest thing ever, because it just shows me that she really cares about me. And like there are days where like I don't have an appetite, but she'll still bring food to me and make sure that I eat. And it's just like little gestures like that that make it really that show that they really do care. And even though like they may not have an understanding of mental illness at first, because there's the cultural aspect to it, and it's oftentimes like taboo to talk about it in Asian countries. They really made an effort to educate themselves on what I was going through, and it really showed over the years that they gained a better understanding of mental illness. And I think that it's important for people who have a loved one that has a mental illness to educate themselves, because sometimes it's just really hard to put into words how we feel. And so I think just to repeat what I was saying, just to let them know that you're there for them, not to judge them, not to criticize them, but to open up that line of communication and let them know that they'll be there when you're ready to talk.
Thanks, Sandy. Dr. Chen, I know that you are second generation. You were born and raised in the US, and I'm the immigrant parents. So culturally, there's a difference there between me and my children. So what do you think from your perspective, the obstacles or hurdles or the barriers of communication between the two generations, perhaps culturally or even generationally? So.
Of course. Such an important question, and I'll share some thoughts, and Wei Young, I'm assuming they want to add. Before I answer that question, that very important question, Paul, I also just want to acknowledge and thank Tim and Sandy for being so honest and genuine and real with their answers. My heart is like personally and professionally like so full. I was so moved by, Tim, your story about your mom playing video games with you and sharing activities. And that's always an important point I'm wanting to highlight, that communication and connection, like connection too, is so tremendously powerful. It doesn't always have to be with words. It can be with an activity. And I think the two of you like captured, I think, so many of the major points of parent guidance that Wei Young and I are often trying to share with parents who so earnestly are trying to connect with their children. So thank you both for capturing that so perfectly and lovingly. I also love the little bowls and plates of fruit that I get, and I think I will always love them. In terms of the kind of this extra challenges, I referenced this in passing at the very beginning, and I think this could be the topic of an entire webinar. And again, it's not faulting anyone, but I think it is a reality for first generation parents of all backgrounds who do so much and sacrifice so much to come here and to provide for their families. And something that I've heard again and again from teens, I should tell you, kids and teens, were echoed perfectly in what Tim and Sandy just captured in terms of kind of these very universal challenges of where communication can be a little bit hard. And sometimes I think 1.5 and second generation kids really, really feeling, and it's out of love and appreciation, but really feeling a great responsibility to, it's almost like to make up for all that our parents have sacrificed. Because I think we know how much we think we know, and my guess is we only even know the tip of the iceberg. I know how much my parents, did to come here. And so I think children, my generation and younger, like we often feel like we really, really want to make our parents and grandparents and families proud. And so that's a wonderful thing, right? I think that connection to family, but there can be a potential cost where kind of that extreme pressure or guilt, or when we hit a stumbling block, or maybe we don't get that perfect grade or get into that college or do that thing that we really, really, really want to do or achieve for ourselves or our families, it can feel like a monumental failure, even though I always really want to try to normalize disappointments or failures. So I think some of it is that. I think obviously there's language barriers. I'm not very good at Chinese. I think I speak like a a 4 or 5-year-old. And so that really gets in the way, I think, language barriers, cultures, and the fact that the way families communicate in China, there's so many strengths there, right? But it's very, very different. And so your children are Chinese, but growing up American, right? So they have both Chinese cultural parts about them, and I love that side of me, but I also grew up here, and there's just an inherent tension there, not because one is better than the other, but because in some ways they're dramatically different in terms of the emphasis on values, in terms of some of the communication styles. So the more that there can be these open lines of communication that Tim and Sandy referenced, it doesn't eliminate those barriers, but what it does is it helps make those things talk aboutable. And so that when there is a challenge, at least your child hopefully can know, oh, this is something I could talk with my mom or dad about. And hopefully parents could compassionately approach the relationship with that same lens and that same understanding, that maybe your child isn't trying to be oppositional or difficult or disrespectful, but they're trying to navigate this very delicate balance between being both Chinese and American. And maybe they need a little empathy and compassion and understanding as you're trying to navigate these pieces out. And of course, there's so much more, but I don't know, Wei Young, if there's more that you'd like to add.
Yeah, Juliana, I think that's really well said. I think for me, I'm a first generation, and I grew up in a traditional Chinese family in China before I came to the US. Just looking back my personal experience, I think there are a lot of things in my family dynamic, my parents' parenting style, that have served as positive contributors to my psychological resilience. For example, my father has always been highly involved and very supportive. But also on the flip side, when I look back, there are also certain factors in parenting style in traditional Asian families that can make your children be more vulnerable to certain mental health issues. I know there are a lot of research saying that Asian or Asian American families tend to be more of an authoritarian style, which means that we are more high demand, and we are more high demand and less warmth, or more emotionally reserved. So there are some studies showing that being critical or being harsh or being less emotionally explicit in supporting your children sometimes can be the barriers and causing some of the contributing to some of the psychological challenges, especially internalizing problems, for example, depression. So just reflecting on my own personal experience and thinking about how that is related to family dynamic and parenting style sometimes.
And Paul, may I make just one addition, because the original question was related to communication and like what parents can do. And I just very, very briefly wanted to make an additional point, because I believe so much in trying to decrease stigma and break the silence around mental health issues. And so really this is something that all of us, parents, non-parents, children, can do, that even for parents on this call, even if your child isn't struggling with mental health issues, right? That the more we can destigmatize mental illness, the more this will facilitate and open up conversations. Because even if within your household, perhaps you are a more psychologically aware household and you work really hard to try to keep open lines of communication, the reality is in the larger society, even in the US, where I think there is really terrific understanding of mental health issues, in general around the world, there isn't. We still have a far way to go. And the reality is within most minority communities, and definitely within the Chinese community, I think we're a little bit further behind. And so even if in your family, you try to emphasize, oh, it's okay to talk about feelings and stress, there is still the societal stigma around mental health issues. So the more we can all normalize stress challenges, normalize challenges with mental health struggles, I think that will also open up the dialogue and can help on an individual level, parents and children communicate with each other. So meaning we all can help in some way.
This is such an important question, because this, I would say, it probably is the root of the problems we all face. You know, the lack of communication. Because of lack of communication, children may feel like they're lonely, they're struggling alone. So I think, you know, I would like to take the liberty to editorialize a little bit about the communication. I've given a lot of thoughts on this topic as well. So I think one of the most important thing, I got a lot of questions from parents, you know, they say, you know, my child doesn't have motivation. Um, they they don't have the ambition. They're lazy. You know, I the questions I got seems to be very consistent that parents only see flaws in their children. They only see flaws. They only see problems in their children, and that's the problem, right? I think the most important thing is if we can accept the flaws, that will open up the communication. When we only see flaws and children don't want to be judged, I think Sandy and Tim both mentioned that they don't want to be judged. Uh, they don't want to be viewed as a failure, not meeting the expectation of the parents. So I think it's a balance. You certainly we have to set a good set expectation for our children. But if we can only see flaws in our child, you see problems there, that will be very difficult for our children to come to us. So I think we need to accept the flaws. And that's probably what Juliana was saying, that it's kind of like normalization of flaws, right? So we are all flawed person. We parents are flawed too. It's normal to be flawed. It's normal to be vulnerable. It's normal to be depressed. Depression is actually is, you know, destigmatize depression is treating it as a normal health condition. If we can treat that normal health condition, then I think that will help open up the channel of communication. I'm sorry for the for the face.
No, it's
Yeah,
wonderful,
let's
Paul.
move on.
It's you're also a father and a devoted community member, and it's so well said. So thank you. We completely agree.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's also the lesson I learned. You know, I cannot accept the flaws. That's the problem. That's been the root of conflict between me and my children, because I cannot accept their flaws.
Yeah.
So
And I think
Well,
one thing I just want to add is that I think that's such a great point that you bring up, is how do we see things in our children? Do we see it compassionately, or will you see it judgmentally or critically? And that view will also be passed to our kids when they see the world, when they see themselves, but basically what they are doing, how they are going to do it is a copy paste from our parents. So if we are critical, they will be self-critical. And we know self-criticism can be contributing factors to a lot of mental health issues. So if we want to help them to build their psychological resilience, and we can do it as parents in our daily life by adjusting how we view them and how we see things in general. So I think that's a wonderful point that you raised up there.
Let's move on. I think Juliana said really well. We can develop the whole webinar on this communication issue.
Yes.
This is, yeah, it's such an important issue. Maybe in the future we'll have a separate topic to devote it to this topic. So let's move on to one of the other questions I think a lot of parents are asking. What can I do, right? What steps, if I know or if I suspect my child has mental health struggles, what steps can I take? I think I will ask Dr. Xie and Dr. Chen, because you guys are experts.
We're happy to talk about that part, and Juliana and I think the most important thing I would say, along with what we just talked about, the communication piece is very important. How you can communicate and share your care and share your empathy to your children in that situation is very important. So I would encourage parents to be a good listener in situations like this. That's the very important first step. I think we're all good at fixing problems and giving advice, especially when we see our kids struggling, and we tend to get into the analytical mind and think about what may have caused it or what we can do to change. But I think a lot of times what your kid needs probably just a space for them to express their emotions and feelings that have been built up that they don't have a place to talk about. And another thing I would encourage parents to do in addition to listen is to ask questions in order to understand their life and emotional difficulties. We talk about there's this gap of communication between two generations. A lot of times our parents are so busy, we may not be attentive to our children's life. So that is a good opportunity for us really to us to know what is going on and to catch up. And another thing is to be do not invalidate or minimize your children's experience when they share with you. I think one of our student panelists mentioned this story last time in one of the webinar we had previously when he disclosed his mental health. The response from the parent is two words: don't be. Don't be, right? And also sometimes we also hear parents saying everything's going to be fine, or they don't understand your life is good, why are you feeling this way? So I think those are the things that we probably need to avoid saying, because that can invalidate in their experience. Instead, what we can say is, I'm sorry you are feeling this way. It must be hard to live with those emotions, to live with these feelings. I think a little bit of validation, a little bit of normalization can go a long way. And the last part comes to the help piece, right? How can we help them? And I think the best way, and then probably the most effective way, is to ask them, what can I do to help in this situation? Before you offer any advice that you think would work, give a space for them to talk about that. And know sometimes in reality, the child may not be able to articulate that, or may not be able to find something immediately. And I think what we can do is to be there with them and offer that space if they want to talk about. Or if you want to offer advice, do something that is simple and practical, right? Would you like to take a walk together? And I'm here to listen and support you. And would you like me to help you seek out a professional to talk more if you feel more comfortable? So something simple and practical, and that can help them. I know one thing that Juliana and I we are thinking about that is important related to this question is that depression is usually a risk for suicide thoughts, your children, right? So a lot of times parents also struggle with, if my kids have suicidal thoughts, what I'm going to do about it. And what we would like to recommend is that if you have any suspicion, and do not hesitate to ask that question. Are you having any suicidal thoughts? And I think that's the part a lot of times parents are scared of asking, because they're worried if I ask that question directly, I'm going to put that thoughts into their mind. And I want to say here, there's no research behind showing any of that. It is simply not true. As a matter of fact, asking that question directly can provide a lot of relief for the child, because oftentimes when we struggle with suicidal thoughts, and we tend not to share it with others, and also asking that thoughts can serve as the first step for your child to get help. Sometimes they may not directly share with you about their suicide thoughts, but suicide thoughts can be indirect in many ways. For, let's say, young children, they may not be able to articulate that, and how it manifests itself is they probably get more preoccupied, obsessed with death and suicide, the concept of that, and then they may wear clothes that reflect that theme, or they might keep a journal talking a lot about that, watching TV related to that. So I think it's important for us as parents to know those warning signs in addition to asking those questions. I would just go a little bit more on the warning sign piece, and just to give a couple of examples there. Sometimes the change in our mood and behaviors can be warning sign. We know depression is related to a lot of the teen and children's suicide, and also talking about that, right, directly, indirectly, and wanting to die or not be around. Sometimes that can be a word or sentence related to their suicidal thoughts. Increased social isolation, significant change in their appearance or hygiene or their sleep. All of those can be warning signs. And also, I think the important part for parents to know is that when you ask those questions, your job is not to do assessment or is to provide advice on what to do the next step. And what we usually recommend is to seek for professional. If you notice your children are having thoughts of suicide, and ask for help immediately. I know Juliana can speak probably more on how to ask for help, the steps parents can go through.
Right.
Yeah, of course. I'll just add on a little bit. And Wei Young, thank you for such a thought. I agree with all those recommendations. So nicely said. Want to highlight as well. So this model, right, of listening first, and being open to learning from your children as kind of one of the first steps in terms of what to do, what a parent can do if they're concerned, is a nice model in general. So like not just if you have a concern about your child. And I recognize this runs a little counter to more kind of a traditional Chinese way where there isn't as much kind of the back and forth dialogue or communication or the listening to the child. But this is to touch on kind of that challenge that Paul asked about earlier, kind of the East meets West, and the challenge between different generations is there's a difference in style of communication. But really one way you can really, really support your child and connect with them and potentially prevent even the onset of mental health challenges is having that open dialogue. So really asking, listening, and being open to hearing whatever it is that's coming. That's just a great model in general. And wanted just to remind you that if you are listening or you make a suggestion and not a lot is coming back, if this is a new way of speaking in your family, it's not necessarily going to lead to huge dialogue right away. This is something that's going to take a little bit of practice. So please don't give up, and know that maybe things never change and your child or teen may stay a little quiet or private, and that developmentally, this is completely healthy and normative for teenagers to want to have a private life. So the goal is less that now we talk all the time and my teenager tells me everything. And some parents have that relationship with their teenager. But the goal, I think, is more that your teen knows that they could come to you. So still show up, still ask, still give that unconditional love, still give the message that you care. Kind of Sandy talked about this really beautifully, and that you are still accomplishing something. So that in general, they know they can come to you, and certainly in times of greater seriousness, or if they're struggling in some way, they know that door is open. And also briefly wanted to acknowledge that these challenges of maybe a parent being critical, or wanting to rush to, telling a child or teenager what to do, I think the intentions there are all good intentions, right? They're coming from a place of great love. And even the criticism, I think, is often with the goal of motivation. So just want to acknowledge, we know that too. It's how can we have the support come in a way that actually is going to feel supportive to children and teenagers. More concretely, in terms of getting help, if you are worried, absolutely. If there's a big red flag in terms of escalating substance use, self-harm, suicide statements, or really what we would call like dysregulated behavior, meaning your child is feeling or teenager is seeming like out of control, right? Acting really aggressively, very oppositional or violent in some way, these are more extreme things. These are emergencies. Just like if there was a medical emergency, someone got in a car accident or fell and broke their leg, you would call 911 or go to the emergency room. That's what the emergency room is for, right? So if there was an immediate big thing, you would call the emergency room. If you have concern, but there isn't an emergency worry, then the question is how, where do we go for help? The easiest first place to go, recognizing that you're all living in different places in different parts of the US, also have different access, like different levels or avenues for care, unfortunately. There aren't as many resources in some parts of the country than others. But the best first place that parents can reliably go is to your child's pediatrician, because hopefully all children have a pediatrician, and pediatricians are doctors and can assess for basic mental health conditions. And if there is kind of a more complex question, or they're thinking that referral to a psychiatrist or other mental health specialist or therapist might be helpful, a pediatrician should be able to help with that. When school is in session, this is for kind of like lower levels of concern, know that schools can also be wonderful places for partnership, and school counselors can also oftentimes see children and teenagers, or at least help with kind of another perspective to help you get an understanding or assess, kind of how worried you should be. But in terms of medical treatment, I think the pediatrician is generally the best first step. And then of course you can then from there go on to care with a social worker, psychologist, or psychiatrist. But again, don't let, how should I say, big red flags like suicide statements or acts aren't the only reason to seek care. Those are absolute reasons to seek care. But the goal of webinars like this are to help parents know about what to look out for, and really to be accessing that care and to get the help earlier. So if you have a worry about your child in any way, please don't worry alone. Talk to someone and get professional help.
Thank you, Dr. Shan, and thank you, Dr. Shea. I think some of the problems parents raised is that, obviously the children don't like to talk to the parents, or even the parents want to get help, children don't want to cooperate. So I guess these problems are a cumulative effect of over years of lack of communication, right? So it's hard to say, is there any secret way to get your child to talk to you and go to get help? And that's difficult. I guess if parents are faced with that situation, the child doesn't want to get help. In the case of Tim and Sandy, they do want to get help, but there are cases child don't want to get help. How do parents do? How do we persuade the children to get help?
This is such an important question, Paul, and I'm sure Wei Young has the same experience. This is something I struggle with as a doctor, and there are even children and teens who are in my office who are seeing me, and they've gotten to the point where they're open to seeing me, but they're really reluctant to do anything beyond that. And honestly, it sometimes can take some time. And so my role when I'm in that situation is essentially meeting the child where they're at. So recognizing they're not yet ready for more. Maybe I think they actually need medication, or they need more regular therapy, or they need a higher level of care, and they're not yet open to it. But at least they're willing to see me. So I'm going to try to keep that relationship a positive relationship. I'm going to try to keep open lines of communication. I'm going to try to educate the child. And when they're ready, I'm going to be ready. Parents can kind of take the same approach. And it can be very, very painful and very scary when parents know and want to get the child to treatment. But this is where, unless there's a safety worry, I think the party there is really, and Sandy and Tim both hinted at this, right, or spoke explicitly about this, having some patience, having some compassion, not pushing, because actually the more you push, you can get into a push and pull and the child will shut down. And like you said, Paul, there isn't something magic. So maybe letting them know they're there, you're there for when they're ready.
Thank you. How about Tim and Sandy? Because I think there are some of the parents may have some concern about certain medications, or even concern about the counseling, whether the counseling can actually be counterproductive, or can cause more the mistrust between the parents and children, right? So there are concerns out there. Perhaps you can talk about your experience with psychologists, counseling sessions, or even medication, if you feel comfortable.
Yeah, like I said earlier, it took me a while to actually agree to see a psychiatrist and agree to go into counseling. But honestly, even from the first time going through the motions of like talking with my therapist and talking about myself and my struggles, I just felt like there was this huge weight lifted off of me, because there was just there was just a lot of things I could not deal with myself, and it'd been years since like my first therapist session where I don't know, I think I pretty much cried through the second half of my session. But I thought after that, it was just really helpful to have somebody who was there to listen to your troubles and give you some advice on how you can, not change yourself, but how you can look at things differently. And because there was always specific ways that I'm looking at the situation that I'm in, and the different kind of pressures that I put on myself, having an outside view really helped me be able to realize that like some of the things that I've struggled with, honestly was from myself rather than from my outside environment. And I do see one of the parents asked about ADHD medication. I did not have a great time with my ADHD medication the first time around. I struggled, and I was probably even more moody than I was when I was not taking it. It was a combination, so I had to try a different one, a couple different ones before I found one that suited myself. And taking an antidepressant and something that also helped with my anxiety really helped me to be able to voice my problems. I noticed, like at least my mom tells me, like it was pretty obvious, like 1 week or 2 weeks after I started my antidepressants, I was able to more voice my concerns. And personally, I felt that I wasn't like watched or judged by everybody that I met. That was something that I struggled with a lot. But after taking that, it was more, I was more confident about the person that I was, and realized that I didn't need to prove myself as much as I did. And from that, I started becoming more like myself again. And it was just easier for me to talk to people and easier for me to convey like what was upsetting me rather than just hiding myself and locking myself in my room.
Thanks, Tim. How about Sandy? Can you share your story?
I remember when I first started seeing my psychiatrist, I was really reluctant about taking my medication because I felt like if I took medication, then that means that there's something wrong with me. And I remember I just wasn't really receptive to it for a long time until like I started realizing that it's nothing to be ashamed of. If it helps me, then it helps me, and I should embrace that. And the same goes with therapy as well. I remember when I first started seeing my first therapist, I just wasn't really opening up about what I was going through, and I was just really ashamed, I guess, of being there. But over time, I learned to I learned that there's nothing to be ashamed about, and it's actually really helpful to get all these thoughts out that are normally just stuck in your head, and it's helpful to talk about these things because I'm just used to bottling things up so much that it was when I finally started talking about what I was going through, it just felt like a weight was lifted off my shoulders. And I think it's also important to note that like regular therapy may not be for everyone. I when I was hospitalized, I really relied on art therapy as well, and writing my feelings down helped a lot too. And there are just lots of other types of therapy. If one type of therapy doesn't work for you, there's other types that are out there. And the same goes for medication as well. I remember I switched around my medications a bunch of times before I finally found one that worked for me. And I think it's just important to have patience and to like note the side effects, because I remember I was taking this antidepressant, and not only did it give me like physical side effects, like I was breaking out in hives, but it also just made me feel even more depressed. So I think it's just really important to realize and like take note of how medications make you feel. And also, I also switched around with my therapist as well, because I felt that sometimes I felt like sometimes I felt like I was being judged by my therapist, and sometimes I felt like I just didn't feel comfortable talking to them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to realize that it's not like one size fits all. You're allowed to seek out other people, you're allowed to seek out other medications. So I think it's just to be persistent, because it's your health, and at the end of the day, yes, to it's hard to be persistent sometimes. It's hard to keep going, but it's really worth it.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Chen, can you talk a little bit about the various medications out there? Some parents may have some skepticism or concerns about side effects or any of that. Can you because I think you're pretty familiar with that. So can you talk about different medications? And there's also one parent asking about there is special ECT type of treatment. So maybe also briefly address that.
Both topics are very big topics, Paul, but I'll do my very, very best. And honestly, Tim and Sandy did such an amazing job, I think, both of sharing their personal stories and honestly, I think very real life experiences with medication. Of course, each person's experience is different, but there's so much there that I think is pretty universal. So there are lots of medicines. They are used widely, safely, and effectively. There are actually many categories of medicine that we use for depression. I'm going to focus it for the sake of simplicity and time and the topic of this webinar on depression. There are actually many categories of medicines that we use for depression and many categories of antidepressants. But the main first line medicines that we use for depression are a category of medicines called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are also very commonly used for things like anxiety and OCD and a range of other mental health disorders. And so names of medicines that might sound familiar are things like Prozac, Celexa, Lexapro, Zoloft. These are very, very widely used medications. To highlight for depression in particular, for mild to moderate depression, the first line treatment, meaning what we first recommend and where there is the greatest evidence base for positive benefit, is actually therapy. So if someone's in my office with mild to moderate depression, depending on other factors and circumstances and how long they've been struggling, et cetera, but in general, the first line treatment, what I'm recommending is a good therapist. So kind of what Tim and Sandy were describing their experiences, and just to know that sometimes that may feel like a really good fit right away, and sometimes it may mean meeting with more than one person, and that's okay, but please don't give up if the first person doesn't feel like a good fit. For more moderate to severe depression, the gold standard treatment is combination therapy and medication. And then as I mentioned, that medicine is usually an SSRI. Very broadly, these are medicines that people take once a day. For children and teenagers, maybe with their first round of depression, I would not think of these medicines as a forever medicine. That's something that parents often ask me about. In the same way, of course, it's not exactly the same, but in the same way, if you had an infection, you might start an antibiotic and you'd be on that antibiotic for a certain period of time to treat this medical infection. The depression medication is there to help treat the symptoms of depression, some impact in functioning in some way. The difference between, an antidepressant and antibiotic, this is very, very simplified. But most antibiotics, I think that we're accustomed to, you would think of, you're taking it for a number of days or a number of weeks. Antidepressants, you should think of as more months and potentially up to a year or even longer. But it's not necessarily thought of at the first try as a forever medication at all. It's really to help decrease the symptoms now. These medicines and antidepressants in general are not habit forming. They're not addictive. They don't change a person's personality. The goal, and Tim had mentioned this, the goal is to help your child or teenager return to their functioning, to return to them feeling like themselves again. And all of this would be monitored very closely by a medical professional and would look out for symptoms. And if the medication didn't work or bothered your child in any way, they could taper the medicine, get off the medicine. And then, as both of them mentioned, it might take a few tries before you find the right one. But just like I wouldn't want you to give up on therapy, not to give up on medication, if the first one doesn't work. All of this would be monitored very safely. The most common side effects, there's a range and it's very individual, but most commonly it might be things like mild headache or stomach upset. Sometimes it can be a little activating, make you feel a little jittery or anxious. Sometimes it can be a little sedating and make you feel a bit tired. And then there are less common, more severe side effects, but that really would be helpful for your medical professional to sit down with you. And ideally, any questions you have, that person would be reviewing all those, mild and moderate and more severe side effects with you and answer any questions that you have. That's really, really a broad overview. I know we're kind of short on time, Paul. Should I keep going on the ECT or?
Yeah, I think that's probably is okay because ECT probably is out of the mainstream.
It's very, it's a very effective treatment, but this is for people who have, generally are much more severe illness. They're already in medical treatment. So that person would probably already have someone to talk to.
It's more later line.
Much, much, much later line.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I think we are approaching the end of the session. There are a lot of questions posted in the Q&A box. I think we have addressed the range of questions from symptoms, contributing factors, communication, and what if kids refuse to get help. So there's no easy answers to these questions because they are all complex. For example, in terms of symptoms, like Dr. Xie and Dr. Chen said, there is no one set of symptoms. But important thing is, let me summarize what we already learned. The important thing is the persistence symptoms. If you see some persistent problems, so that would be a warning sign that may be caused by depression. So on the symptom side. On the contributing factor side, you guys mentioned that there's not a single factor, there are multiple factors. So obviously stress, low self-esteem, and bully, and all these things, social factors and the genetic factors contribute to depression. In terms of communication, we talked about, again, there is no easy solution. The problem is many years, the effect of many years of lack of communication. The solution will be many years of patient repairment of that lack of communication. That will take many years. If your kids reject you, if your kids reject to get help, be patient. I guess you have to keep going at it. And I always like to say that we have to accept our kids are flawed. We have to accept who they are and give them unconditional love. I think it's, there are many questions we may not be able to provide the answer. It's ongoing dialogue. We really appreciate the panelists volunteering your time. It's you all come here without pay. So in the end, I want to give Justin a chance to say a few words. Justin, are you still online?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect, great.
Okay, I'm so sorry about this. I'll try to convert my comments. They were supposed to be introductory, but this will now be a wrap up. So it's been really such a privilege to be part of this important event and hear from all of these incredible speakers, including Sandy and Tim, who so courageously and vulnerably shared their stories with you, as well as the experts and practitioners of mental health, Juliana and Wei Yang, who I am proud to call my colleagues and my friends, and then the incredibly skillful facilitation by Paul Lee, who continues to be such an amazing advocate for these issues. This is a heavy topic. I'm a psychiatrist, and even when I hear this, Even though I work with it all the time, I'm struck by how hard it can be to have these conversations. But I do believe it is so important that we are doing this. And I'm thankful to each of you who is participating for taking the time out of your Saturday to attend. I also especially wanted to send my sincere gratitude and admiration again to Paul Lee, Lily Chen, Haipei Xu, and everyone else at UCA who has been tirelessly raising this message about mental health awareness in our Asian American community. I think it is critical that all of us in our community help break silences in the so-called model minority, recognizing that we all struggle, as was mentioned, and spread the message that no one is alone in these struggles. There's a community of caring individuals who are here and prepared to help. So I was asked to speak just for a few minutes by Lily and Paul about my own background and why I do this work. So as is typical during these types of events, earlier Paul, when he was introducing each of us, talked a lot about everyone's professional accomplishments and educational accomplishments that help justify why we're here today. But the fact is that most of us, myself included, are just like many of you or your children. My parents are immigrants from Taiwan who moved to the US in the 1970s in search of a better life and opportunities for their kids. And I grew up in the suburbs of Northern Virginia, which my parents had specifically moved to because of the excellent public school system there. And they were so proud when I was accepted to Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, as you all heard earlier. So I am very, very grateful, of course, for the education I got at TJ and the many friendships and life lessons I gained there. And at the same time, high school was one of the most stressful periods in my entire life, perhaps more so than even my intern year of medical residency. People don't believe me when I say it, but it's true. The pressure to succeed and the competition were really enormous. And, thankfully I was lucky and I have a good outcome from that. But that was the result of, certainly hard work and my parents' sacrifices, but also a lot of luck. And I think I know, and a lot of others know many others who have not been so fortunate. So the recent suicide of an Asian American senior at that same high school, which I understand is the second one affecting the same class, has devastated the community once again. And my heart really is breaking for the family and friends of that young man. It's really difficult for most of us to imagine the tremendous pain he must have been in to take his own life. Some of you may have heard suicide referred to as a selfish act. How could someone be so selfish to take their life? In fact, those of us who work every day with patients with depression and suicidal thoughts know that usually the opposite is true. So depression really distorts a person's thoughts and it makes them feel very guilty and worthless, kind of like they're a burden on other people. And often when we read suicide notes, they're filled with apologies and self-blame. So I just wanted to share that far from being a selfish act, suicide is sometimes seen as a way of relieving others of a burden, which is the twisted logic of a depressed mind. Another point I wanted to make is that for every one student who takes his or her own life, there are many, many more who have thought about and even attempted suicide, and we heard about some of that here today with our panelists. Often these individuals feel hopeless, alone, ashamed, and mistakenly believe that they are the only ones who feel this way and that they should not burden others with their feelings. And again, I just want to thank Sandy and Tim for giving us a window into that experience. Some of you may also know that one of today's speakers, Juliana Chen, helped produce a documentary called Looking for Luke. This documentary was about the suicide of a sophomore at Harvard University in 2015, who was the son of Chinese immigrants. The fact is that success is not an antidote against the demons of depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses. If anything, those who are very outwardly successful may feel even more pressure to always be perfect, never mess up, not let anyone else down or see the demons inside. Thankfully, as we've heard today, depression and anxiety are very treatable. And with the right supports, people can and do get better. So just as we would never tell someone who had pneumonia or a broken arm to just get over it and work harder, we need to start to recognize that psychological distress indicates a problem that needs to be addressed, not stigmatized, with understanding, concern, and appropriate care. These are not weaknesses of personality or things to be ashamed of. Stress is normal and a part of life, And yet everyone has times that they struggle and they need help. The sooner we can help everyone understand that, including our young people, the sooner we can halt these tragedies that continue to devastate our communities. So I'll close these comments by saying that depression and anxiety are illnesses that affect individual people, but we cannot understand them solely at the level of the individual. As Dr. Chen mentioned earlier, problems like depression and suicide have biological, psychological, and social contributors. And I'll share an anecdote. A few years ago, members of our center had the opportunity to travel down to Virginia, to TJ, to give a talk about the importance of emotional wellness for long-term success. And as I talked to people in the community there that I myself grew up in, students, parents, teachers, all at my former high school, I was really struck by how complex the situation was. And everyone was pushing blame elsewhere. Teachers felt that parents were pushing their kids too hard. Parents felt teachers and the school were making too many advanced electives and classes available, including many college-level classes, which was sort of leading almost to like an arms race among students who felt compelled to push the boundary.
We can't hear you now, Justin. We lost the connection.
I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm traveling today. I'm struggling with our new Zoom reality. So we went down to TJ to talk, and then I was mentioning that everyone was blaming each other. The parents were blaming the teachers for making it too hard for students and having too many opportunities. And the teachers were blaming the parents for pushing their kids too hard. And then the students were feeling caught in the middle, that they had to compete and outdo each other to gain acceptance to a very small handful of prestigious universities. And then some students told me it wasn't actually the parents at all. It wasn't the parents putting pressure. It was the environment itself. And you know, in my clinical work now in Boston with students at MIT and Harvard, I see echoes of these problems still. The students have a very narrow and very often unrealistic understanding of what it means to be successful. And they're often miserable because of it. So I just will close by saying, in addition to understanding how to recognize depression and support those who are struggling with it, I want each of you to take some time today or this weekend to reconsider the definition of success. Both for yourself and for your family members. What is most important in life? And what are the costs of all of that success? How are we all contributing to the systems that result in the suicides of young people? And what could we do to change that? So again, my apologies for all the challenges with technology, but thank you again for being with us. And thanks to all of our speakers.
Thank you, Justin. That topic, what is considered success, can be another topic for future sessions. Yeah, it's very important. Yeah. At the end, I want to thank all the panelists. Also want to thank the organizations that made these series of seminars available for all of us free of charge. Yeah. Also want to thank everybody for joining. Before you go, I have a few, I have some requests for you. You know, we offer these seminars for free, but I would like your help. If you think these seminars are helpful to you, I would like to ask for your support. You can see that there are two QR codes showing up. On the left is the QR code that will bring you to a survey. Please complete the survey. Take your time, complete the survey, because that's going to help us. That's going to help us to not only understand how we're going to improve our program, but also important for us to obtain potentially future grant support. So please do your best to complete the survey. If you feel you want to support us financially, there's a QR code on the right, and you can scan that QR code. That will bring you to the donation page. You will be also receiving an email. If you cannot do it now, you cannot do the survey now, you'll be receiving an email, and please take time to complete the survey. We really appreciate that. Again, I want to thank all of you, the panel members, thank all the audience for coming here on Saturday afternoon, and I wish you all a peaceful and happy weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.